everyone, so today I will be presenting my topic over solitary confinement. And in past history of solitary confinement, the criminal justice system has used restricted housing as a way to control an offender's behavior. Administrative segregation that is used for prisoners who have mental illness and those without mental illness have gained criticism in the past and today. Solitary confinement has been very prevalent in the media, but there is very little research on solitary confinement and the consequences that come with it. The truth about segregation is that the length the prisoner has to stay in there is not known, but more than 80% of prisoners stay there for more than 10 days in one given time. In cases involving juveniles, almost one-third of juveniles in custody have experienced solitary confinement, and half of them has stated they have stayed in there for more than 24 hours. Solitary confinement has been negatively looked at by researchers over the years because of its negative psychological effects it has on an inmate, short-term effects, and long-term effects. In my presentation, I will be discussing these negative effects in my paper, as well as reviewing past research studies to get more information, critique and point out gaps in these studies, and propose a new program that would be implemented in all prisons. For the first portion of my presentation, I will be talking about the risk of self-harm for inmates in restricted housing. Suicide is one of the leading causes of mortality among inmates. However, suicide and suicide attempts only share a small portion of self-harm among inmates. Most inmates who arrive to correctional settings usually have a pre-existing mental illness and a history of harming themselves, but the motivation to harm themselves could come from environmental stress or to avoid being punished. Inmates who hurt themselves while being in solitary confinement could be sent to a therapeutic setting not in solitary confinement, which could lead them to harming themselves again. From the researchers' findings, the researchers found that self-harm was strongly connected with inmates being sent to solitary confinement. Inmates being exposed to solitary confinement were about 6.9 times as likely to harm themselves. Many inmates reported they have or will do anything they can to avoid being in solitary confinement. Those inmates who appear to self-harm to escape solitary confinement are often judged to exhibit volitional or goal-oriented behavior as opposed to suffering from psychosis, mania, or another more recognized mental health symptoms. Another complex factor of solitary confinement is that the inmates in solitary confinement who have a mental illness will receive more sanctions, resulting in more time being spent in solitary confinement. An example of this could be an inmate breaking off a shower head to use the metal to harm themselves, resulting in not only a new sanction and more time in solitary confinement, but also a new criminal charge for demolishing government property. These acts of self-harm can often waste resources that other inmates need. When inmates harm themselves, they receive medical and mental health evaluations as soon as possible and could be sent to a higher care facility, which takes 2 officers from the correctional facility to accompany them. Every 100 acts of self-harm results in 3,760 hours of officers' time and 450 extra clinical meetings in the jail. In the next portion of my presentation, I would like to discuss specific psychological effects that prisoners can experience while being in solitary confinement. Researchers who have studied solitary confinement in the past have believed that inmates who are segregated from other prisoners for a longer amount of time may be robbed of regular human interaction, and resulting from that, these inmates have a difficult time in learning to socialize with people normally. They argue that being segregated is detrimental to a person because they are not receiving the right amount of stimulations needed. Other researchers argue that it is questionable whether segregation actually reduces the amount of stimulation. They explain that most prisoners in segregation still have conversations with prison guards and other prisoners, and they can still have access to books, mail, their lawyers, visitors, and sometimes be able to get a hold of radios and televisions. Other authors argue that being in solitary confinement can bring upon a past psychiatric condition. For example, Wadeson and Carpenter concluded that segregation stimulates hallucinatory activity that provokes paranoia among some mental health patients. Many authors have expressed that this relationship made between the prison staff and inmates is a significant factor in how inmates cope with being sent to segregation. These researchers argue that there is some indication that when inmates are treated impulsively by prison staff and management, this can cause a lot of psychological stress even in the most humane prison environment. Harassment, physical violence, enforcement and non-enforcement of rules, and unpredictable withholding of privileges may play a greater role than complaints about physical conditions, the social isolation, and the sensory deprivation associated with segregation. Now I will be talking about different characteristics of prisoners in solitary confinement. Personality in different inmates is also another factor in how they will be affected by being in segregation. Some personality characteristics may reduce tolerance for segregation, while other characteristics may enhance it. These segregated inmates were also described as being socially isolated, have relations with drug abusers, have many friends who are also criminals, are easily influenced by other people, and are also hard at communicating in society. Segregation can also affect the inmate's likelihood of receiving parole, being admitted to a halfway house, and disturb their security classification. If an inmate knows about these consequences, it can affect the way that the inmate copes with being in segregation. Prisoners complaining about their food and delayed response to materials they need, such as medication, phone time, counselors, books, etc., can also affect their segregation experience. Some difficulties in cognition with these individuals would include unable to solve interpersonal problems, inability to make good choices, ignorant about consequences, unrealistic goals, no respect for others, not socially involved, not aware of other people's feelings, not well at resolving conflicts, very frustrated, hostile, manipulative, seeks thrills, and rigid thinking. They also see their relationships to be inevitable, have no respect for other people's property, no sense of directions in their lives, and be a nonconformist. In the last portion of my presentation, I will be giving my ideas about the different programs, policies, and plans I have to reform solitary confinement. My first plan is to make the rooms of solitary confinement bigger and more enthusiastic and motivation to the rooms. This could give the prisoners more room to do activities in, and also a bigger room can help the prisoner not feel so enclosed in a tight space. For more enthusiasm and motivation in a room, I would like to have the prisoners be able to put pictures up of their family, friends, artwork, and any other motivational posters to help the prisoner feel better about being in solitary confinement. I believe this will also improve the prisoner's mood overall. Another idea I have would be to give prisoners in solitary confinement more time outside of the cell. 23 hours in an enclosed small cubicle without any interaction can take a drastic toll on an inmate's emotional and psychological well-being. Even though I only gave the inmates an extra 3 hours out of their cell, I think it would be beneficial to their psychological health. Within these 4 hours of freedom from their cells, I would like to set up a program for them to meet with more counselors and mental health professionals to get the health care they need. I would also like for them to meet with these professionals for at least an hour every day so they can receive the therapy and support they need while being in solitary confinement. Going off of this idea of more counselors and mental health professionals in the prisons and jails, I would like to make a new policy that states there needs to be more of these professionals in the correctional facilities. We would need to set up extra funding to hire these individuals. By hiring these individuals can help these inmates tremendously. Most inmates who are sentenced to solitary confinement have a severe mental illness upon arrival, and they do not receive the healthcare and services they need in prisons and jails. As I stated earlier, inmates without a mental illness that arrive to solitary confinement might not have a mental illness, but could develop depression, anxiety, and poor social skills from not interacting with other individuals. When these inmates leave solitary confinement, they have problems going back into society, and I think giving them these professionals' help will help them reintegrate back into the real world. Going off of this idea, I would like to set up a program for not just the inmates who are sent to solitary confinement, but also the general prison population. This program will be a teaching program that teaches prisoners how to function back into society after they leave prison. This program will show inmates how to get a job, get a place to live, transportation, and how to reintegrate back into the real world. Many prisoners who leave prison become homeless because of the lack of knowledge and resources to help them get them back on their feet.